It's me! This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Ghostfire Gaming is going to be at PAX Oz.
I don't know what we're doing. I am excited about Bastions.
Well, MCDM is catering for more of a, granular kind of crowd. I suspect that we're going to see something that is a more streamlined version of the same thing.
I invite you to buy the Acquisitions Incorporated book where you can build your franchise.
Wizards of the Coast has recently taken responsibility for Magic the Gathering's Commander format.
The extent of the economic impact could have been as high as $150 million.
And it's kind of the situation where it's the fans who've ruined it for everyone else. Start sending death threats, you kind of cede the moral high ground on anything. You have intentionally escalated a situation.
All that and more right now. Now that's high magic.
Anyway, hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG and Australian culinary podcast in all the realms. That's right.
You gotta watch us on Twitch to understand that one, folks.
And we had no countdown today because we are what? Professionals.
Yeah, we're done. We're on the ball today. You watch us at Twitch, on Twitch, the Twitcher, the where the kids twitch out at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific. Apologies to our Australian audience. It is 10 a.m. from now on because of the daylight savings change. We forgot to mention that last week, or I forgot to mention that last week. I won't throw the blame over the rest of you. Anyway, after a strong start, I'm butchering this intro now because if you've never listened to this before, you'd have no idea that my name is Ben Byrne. I'm joined, as always, by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. And James, returning this week, I got a question for you. Do you feel the need to remain current with the tabletop games you play? Are you chasing erratas and facts online? Do you always want to play the latest edition?
There was a time when that was true. There was a time when I would have been absolutely current. I was fiending for Xanathars. I was turned up for Tasha's. But now I'm sort of mild on Mordenkainen. And frankly, too tired about 2024 to this isn't going anywhere, is it? No, I am very proud to have this book in my hands, this exciting player's handbook, but I feel no particular burning desire to stay absolutely current. And that might be because I've started playing more RPGs that are not really live service in any way, right? They're published once and then they're done. And that has made me somewhat relaxed in my advanced stage.
That's such a fascinating term that you've just used to say live service tabletop RPG, right? Because any tabletop game that is in active development, in some sense, is a live service game. Sort of, maybe. But there definitely is like a game that's in active development feels a lot more live service than a game that's not. My example is a war game at the moment, Warhammer Underworlds, which I played years ago when it was sort of first releasing. And then they iterated it upon it in a real live service game way where each new box that came out kind of slightly tweaked the rules or added some things to the rules to the point where once you had not been in that ecosystem for a year or two, you felt really out of date with like where the current war bands, like the products, the miniatures themselves were kind of going out of date slowly in the way that they kept updating the rules of the game. But unlike a video game, I can just crack out those old rules and play. But I feel weird. I feel like that's not what I want to do. Like that's a strange feeling to feel like I'm playing an older version of the game and that I should be updating somehow. And now they're doing a whole new edition version change, which is making that feeling worse. I couldn't quite find the word I was looking for there. But Dael, do you feel the same? Do you feel the need to remain current with tabletop games?
It's funny. I don't think I naturally have that feeling. I think that I would quite happily ignore the river flow and just stay on the bank where I planted my flag. I think I would try bits and bobs of games and just enjoy where I came in, where I bothered to learn them. Like I never updated to Pathfinder 2 as an example.
Sure.
Even though I quite enjoyed
Pathfinder 1?
Pathfinder.
currently?
I don't currently, but I would. I think for me, it's more about the investment of having to like actually pay attention and learn new rules and rules updates and blah, blah, blah. Which I can find, I find a lot more energy within myself to do that for a brand shiny new game than I do for an updated version of a game that I love. But having said all that, I do feel the pressure to keep up with it now because I'm on camera talking about it, and I can't do that if I don't pay attention and keep up with what's going on. So I'm putting my cozies on and I'm getting in the river.
For years, I didn't care at all. We were playing first edition AD&D long after second edition had come out. We played the old version of Top Secret after a new version had come out. But as what Dael said, if it becomes a sort of a job, you kind of have to pay attention. And I was trained by 2020 to keep an eye on things as we had to update the Living Greyhawk, the Adventures League of 3rd edition, had to update the rules when new rules came out and keep an eye on things and make sure everything was working. So I have now sadly become a patron of change.
I think we should all take a focus as gamers to enjoy the game we're playing and do what brings us joy. Or in the case of professionals, money and jobs.
Oh, at Gamehole Con, they're running AD&D 1 hour one shots to celebrate the 50th anniversary of D&D. And I knew about it, but I wasn't quite down with it. I had other things going on. And then today I talked to Alex Kammer, who runs Gamehole Con, and he was so excited and talked about how cool these one shots for AD&D were going to be and the terrain they were going to use. 3 minutes before this podcast started, went and bought a ticket for a 1 hour AD&D game at Gamehole Con. So I'm looking forward to that very much.
Terrain, that sounds like it's up my alley. Tactileness, 3D-ness. Speaking of Gamehole Con and conventions, we are coming into a little bit of a Gamehole Con convention season starting this weekend coming with PAX Australia. For those who celebrate, Ghostfire Gaming is going to be at PAX Oz. We have a booth that's going to be there all weekend. If you come hang out there, I don't have my schedule in front of me, but I may be at that booth quite a bit of the weekend, so you can come say hi if you are so inclined. But Dael and I also have a panel, 8:30 on the Saturday night. That's right, prime time, right when you're ready to listen to a panel on mental health. Because that is the name of our panel, mental health for in the creator space, basically.
And you know what? It's kind of on theme because you're going to get FOMO and various other sort of mental second guessings when you can hear the cheers from the main stage elsewhere, no doubt.
Yes, and our frazzled. We'll ask them to bring the lights down low just to give it a real kind of frazzled feel. Pat's asking in the chat, yes, Ghostfire will be in the tabletop area, kind of among the booths there where I couldn't tell you what the booth number is, but it's fairly close to the entry into the tabletop area. So we shouldn't be too hard to find. Same place as last year for those that came. The panel we're doing, so it's Dael, myself, Luna, who's been a guest on this podcast before, Dave from the YouTube channel Tabletop Time, and Trent from the YouTube channel Miscast. All of us kind of having different experiences in the YouTube space, the creator space, and kind of talking about, for those that might be considering entering the internet as a creator, what some of the mental health pitfalls can be, you know, and some of the things to check in with yourself about and ensure that you're keeping on top of for your own sanity. And hey, it may also just be a big therapy session for the 5 of us. So that'll be a good time. Dael, you have some other stuff going on at PAX Oz as well. Am I not putting you on the spot to
No, this is fine. And I could have done more research last night and I chose not to because I'm now looking at my calendar where I do have my panels sort of entered in, but I've just listed what theater I have to be at, not what panel is what. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think I have, so mine are almost all on the Saturday. On Saturday morning at about 10:30, I'm going to be in the D&D Death Roulette. I believe that's what's happening then. At 1 o'clock, I'm going to be playing in a game run by Adam Carnevale, who you may remember from the Eldritch Lorecast cupboard, where we keep him in between times.
We'll have to
Of
let him
course.
out for PAX.
Yeah. Of course, I've got the mental health panel at 8:30 that night. And then on the Sunday, I think at around 1:30, I'm meant to be in the DnD But Real Part 2, a sequel to last year. So that'll be good.
If you're a Lorecast fan, remember, come let us know by saying bats equals fingers or bats equals wings. I think that was the thing last year. So
Something like that, yeah.
God, it's been a whole year since bats equals fingers. What a time. What a time. And then speaking of conventions, somebody asked in the chat whether we're doing an Ethereal Expanse live play this year. We are not, sadly, because my mental space has also had to share time with Gamehole Con, which is the following weekend. So if you're going to Gamehole Con, Ghostfire will have a booth there. So come say hi. Bats equals fingers, bats equals wings. And Shawn and I have a couple of things going on there. Shawn, we've got 2 panels with the two of us, plus I'm doing a live play. What's our first panel on the Friday?
Now I have to get my calendar. I don't know what we're doing. No, on Friday, we have the Grim Hollow something. Oh, sneak peek. Grim Hollow sneak peek at 1 p.m. The Lorecast is Saturday at 10 a.m.
Indeed, yes. The Lorecast with Latia joining us for that one. Yourself, myself, Latia, and Joe Rasso from Ghostfire Gaming. We'll be talking all things news from Gamehole and the RPG industry. I should note, for those, because we're going to be traveling around, Dante and I are literally on a plane next week, the panel from PAX Oz about YouTube mental health will be the Lorecast episode for next week. So folks listening to the Lorecast will get to hear that, and nobody's missing out on an episode for the week. And then the week after, we're doing the Lorecast at Gamehole, which will be the episode for the week after if you're not going to be at the con. So fear not, nobody's missing out on anything. We're doing a Grim Hollow live play at Gamehole Con, which I will be GMing with Kelly McLaughlin, Latia Jaquise, and Jay Foster from Swolfer Initiative, which I am very much looking forward to. We're coming into the spooky season. So I'm going to try to do a spooky kind of one-shot, as successful as that may be in a live play experience. I should say, for our 3 panels at Gamehole as well, as far as I know, you can be in the room if you want to. They do appear to be selling tickets for those panels on the Gamehole website. They're all ticketed as free, so it's not any more than your entry for the convention. But if you want to come and be there in person, as far as I know, you can be. So go check it out. So that's conventions. James, are you going to Big Bad in a couple of weeks?
I am going to Big Bad Con. It was a little dicey there for a second with the Big Bad Con boycott running, but it sounds like the issues between the boycotters and the con organizers have been resolved. There's a path forward, and truly Big Bad Con is one of my favorite cons of the year, up there with PAX Unplugged too. So I will be there at Big Bad Con, and I hope to see people.
This one's a little bit of a weird one because it's not strictly tabletop role-playing, but it does have to do with Wizards of the Coast, and I had kind of a different point to make about this. But for those that haven't heard, if you're not in the Magic the Gathering community, Wizards of the Coast has recently taken responsibility for Magic the Gathering's Commander format. For folks that don't know, Dael, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this because you're our local commander or our local Magic the Gathering correspondent. Commander is the format where it's more sort of open play, where you're playing with multiple people. Usually the format includes 4 people, and you can kind of gang up on others, target each other, or alliances, backstabbing, that whole sort of thing. Sorry, I don't want to do this, but it's my only option kind of plays. And Commander's very, very popular. It had its own kind of community-led committee, which decided on kind of the meta rules of playing Commander, including like ban lists or restricted lists to ensure that, certain broken combinations weren't being played too often. This is the sort of thing, if you play, this occasionally comes up in war games, but not as nearly as much as it does in card games, which is as more and more cards are produced, certain combinations become much more powerful than they were necessarily intended, especially when really old cards get mixed with really new cards in ways that the designers didn't intend. And so cards can get banned so that those combinations can't necessarily get played out in competitive situations. And the Commander Rules Committee recently banned 4 cards, being Jeweled Lotus, Dockside Extortionist, Nadu, and Mana Crypt. And this triggered a backlash so intense, there were death threats leveled at the 5 members of the committee, which is a bit intense. And the backlash was so intense that Wizards of the Coast stepped in themselves, saying, quote, "Nobody deserves to feel unsafe for supporting the game they love. Unfortunately, the task of managing Commander has far outgrown the scope and safety of being attached to any 5 people."
Pat's in chat does correctly bring up that part of the fuel for that will have been the value of those cards, like the
Yes.
sale value of those cards. But it doesn't excuse it. And I know that you're not saying that it does. You were just giving further information. Pat, I got you. But you know, it doesn't excuse that behavior. And I think it is actually, not only a good move from Wizards, but probably the only move to take over that and take that on themselves rather than leaving it to individual community members. Because, of course, I would love for the actual world to just be people won't level death threats at community members who are trying to keep a play style organized. But since apparently that's not the world we live in, I think it was a good thing for them to come in and say, all right, the corporation is going to tank all of those sort of hissy fits from now on.
I mean, just quickly, community managers as well as community members, you know, in terms of folks that bear the brunt of ire from fans a lot. Shawn, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to basically say what Dael said. The extent of the economic impact could have been as high as $150 million. And that sort of decision making should not be on volunteers. And so the same thing. I don't think Wizards had a choice. It's not only in the best interest of the community, it's in the best interest of Wizards to do that. So
that is an interesting, because I hadn't considered that aspect in complete honesty when I was looking at this story. I had known that the releases of these cards was relatively recent, which, don't get me wrong, as a war game, it kind of sucks. I mentioned Warhammer Underworlds earlier, and sometimes they would do, because that's a kind of hybrid card game, they would create ban and restricted lists for relatively new cards back in the day. The formats have changed to kind of make that less necessary these days. But then that aspect that Magic has a very strong third-party market of kind of, or after-sale market of people selling cards online or selling singles, even in game stores and things. I can see why that would create stronger feelings. But just to reiterate what people have said, I mean, I just think even casually, even if you're kidding, even if you're like, you type the words like, "I hope you die in a fire," and in your mind, it's not that it's a joke, but it's just like you have absolutely no intention of going and setting somebody's house on fire. Just reading that is like mentally harmful for the person on the receiving end of it. This was going to be my segue into talking about our mental health panel for YouTubers, because, you know, people get angry in the comments and don't read the comments, you know, and that's general wisdom for people who are online. But death threats, it's just that one line for me where it's just, that is too far, and your moral stance, whatever it may be, is completely intelligible once you start leveling death threats against anyone.
We had this problem in overseeing organized play.
Sure.
In the sense that, you know, there were times when we had to make rulings, and it was common sense. This spell is obviously unbalanced and is being used in every game, and the game masters are quitting because everyone's playing this way and it's no fun. So we would, you know, ban it or restrict it, and people would get very upset. Death threats, yes. I mean, and I'm not even talking about $150 million. Now I'm talking about somebody mad because they traveled, you know, across the country to play an adventure where they knew they could get this magic item, and then we banned the magic item. So, you know, it was obviously upsetting to them because they had planned on it. But a little perspective is nice.
I was going to say, since we're all pretty much in agreement, Delport Brecklin gives a slightly different opinion that's a bit worthwhile. Says, I don't like that Wizards has been continually consolidating power over something that started out and has always been outside of their authority, because Commander is, and as far as I understand, an unofficial play format. Is very popular, but it's not official. And if this was their decision, I'm not sure that I can fully support it, but this even shows that the format has moved beyond what the people running the format thus far signed up for, and I hope that they were on board with the change.
Yeah, my understanding from what I was reading, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think it was Scipio said that, as far as I understand, it was a mutual decision. It was kind of that committee went like, oh, wow, okay, we did not sign up for this, as members of the community. It wasn't that Wizards were like, we are taking this away from you. It was kind of like, oh, yeah, maybe we should help you with that, and this is not something that you should have to bear the responsibility for.
Well, that's the real trick, right? It's a fan format, and it's kind of the situation where it's the fans who've ruined it for everyone else. I try and be as player friendly, player first as I like. If you've ever watched this show, I take a dim view of most corporate meddling. But when you start, like you said, Ben, when you start sending death threats, you kind of cede the moral high ground on anything. You have intentionally escalated a situation. And when the people who are running it say, we got to get the corpos involved, then clearly you've screwed up, right? You have pushed the issue beyond the level of community fun, because a community that's sending death threats within itself is not much of a community at all. And so it may as well be ceded to some kind of corporate authority.
Yeah, absolutely.
DM Rawlings also gives me a slight correction. They do point out that it's official insofar as they release decks and cards aimed specifically at the format. So it's not technically an official play format, but they do cater to it. They do release sort of Commander decks and things like that.
And this is, for the record, this is not like taking a swipe at the Magic the Gathering community or the Commander community specifically. This happens in video games. This happens all over the shop. When a gun in a video game gets adjusted so that it doesn't put out as much damage as it previously did or whatever, we've heard of this happening in the past. That's a specific example I'm sure somebody can cite me on. I wish I was kidding. And, we've also seen in the last 18 months, there's great examples of kind of corporations being held to account by community kind of backlash and disgruntlement. But, knowing where disgruntlement kind of stops and you've past the Rubicon, so to speak, is, I think, important for folks to keep in mind when they're expressing their outrage online. There are people always on the other end of your messages, whether they're targeted at a community committee or a company.
I wonder how many people issue death threats when the NASDAQ drops. It's the value of a card dropped. If you see the card as an investment, then do you get this peeved about your other investments and not just the ones that have a fancy illustration on them?
Well, this was the other thing this was what I was looking for before. I apologize, I can't remember who posted this, but saying that, remember, and I don't have this perspective on Magic the Gathering, right? So I don't know how fair this opinion is or not, but it seems very fair enough to me, which is like, remember, Magic the Gathering is a game, not an investment, and that it's not being designed for people to invest large sums of money into. That's not going to Wizards, I suppose, it is designed to make money for the company that produces it, but it is not. They're not taking into account the investment portfolio of individuals collecting Magic cards, and so approaching it in that way, you should understand that is fraught. Well, having exhausted
It's Steve. I found them. Sorry.
Thank you. No. Perfect timing.
Perfect timing.
Well, speaking of It's Steve, I'm wondering if It's Steve would has seen the preview of the DMG. Sorry, I lost myself in my own run sheet then. Wizards of the Coast have been putting out, speaking of Wizards of the Coast, there you go, there's a segue, have been putting out previews about the new DMG, which is coming out in November, I believe. They've looked at the setting Greyhawk that they're putting in there. They've looked at the Bastion system. They've talked about the lore glossary, magic items, tracking sheets, which I think are just on the website, not necessarily in the DMG. But anyway, what are folks excited about?
I am excited about Bastions. The first D&D game I ever ran, or the second actually, involved a home base for the party. And ever since then, I have had them in my games, even so far as putting one into Waterdeep Dragon Heist when I was brought onto that project. So to have official support from Wizards, very exciting. Will it be better than MCDM Strongholds and Followers? Will it be worse? Will it be different? My hunch is that it will be, let's call it streamlined. It will be simpler, probably, than MCDM's offering, and probably more broad audience focused. But I think that will see a lot of use in my games.
Well, it's an interesting thing, right? Because when MCDM did Strongholds and Followers, they made no secret that it was basically just revamping the sort of Bastions stuff from old editions of D&D. They were just like, well, they didn't do it, so I guess we'll do it because people seem to think that's fun. And then they did it, and now Wizards are like, oh, wait, we can do that too. Wait, it got how many backers on people want this? We can do that.
How many $1 million?
Yeah. But I do suspect that you're right, that while MCDM is catering for more of a, granular kind of crowd, I suspect that we're going to see something that is a more streamlined version of the same thing. And it's going to be interesting to see how just those very high level sort of conceptual premises, those fantasies of running your own stronghold, do battle with each other, because they're selling the same fantasy. It's only the kind of system underneath the surface that's going to be different.
Well, I have a question in relation to MCDM Strongholds and Followers compared to the Bastion system. Because the Bastion system, one thing that I'm kind of undecided about it personally, and don't get me wrong, I'm actually very excited for it. I can see a lot of use for it in the games that I run. But is the fact that as designed currently, it seems like every player has their own Bastion, kind of, almost like an addition to their character, which in some campaigns, let's say, I don't know, you're just finished toppling the vampiric nobility of a city called Fallowheart in the vampiric-ruled, always nighttime realm of Astoria. And
just a random example.
What an odd thing to
random
say.
example off the top of my head. And now you're ready to kind of start ranging abroad in Astoria, but Fallowheart kind of becomes your home. And so someone in the party has a bastion in the docks, and someone in the party might take the castle itself as their bastion, and someone in the party has a shop or something that's their bastion. That makes sense to me. But there are other campaign examples where I'm kind of like, wouldn't it make more sense if there's like one bastion for the party? Let's say you're an Ethereal Expanse pirate crew, and you've got your pirate boat, and you want to treat that as your bastion. I mean, Ethereal Expanse has its own rules for upgrading your pirate ship and kind of doing that sort of jazz. But just as an example, is the Strongholds and Followers focused on like a bastion for the party, or is it bastions, everybody gets one? So
Strongholds and Followers, it can be an individual player sort of off their own back goes, I want to get a stronghold, so I'm going to build a thieves guild, a theater or whatever. But there is also a sort of separate thing for the whole party coming together and building a stronghold together, which I think I did just pull out the book, but I'm bad at multitasking, so I'm not going to go look it up. I think it's a little bit cheaper if the whole, in the end, if the whole party comes together and says, we're going to make a stronghold for us, and it will have, different wings that do different things.
Well, it's an interesting situation, right? Because the older editions of D&D, their Strongholds and Followers, to coin a phrase, were really fighter class features in essence, right? They were, for the most part, a benefit of being a martial character, because there was this sort of attitude of a command and lordliness and martial power associated with them in much the way that sort of the mystical was the realm of the wizard and such. And so to make it more of a party thing, well, let me take a step back. From that perspective, it seems fairly straightforward as to why Strongholds never really appeared in future editions, right? They were a very impactful narrative element that in some ways kind of excluded the rest of the party from that element of play, the play of managing a territory. And so makes sense for MCDM Strongholds and Followers and all the modern incarnations of that to bring it more in line with the party. And it's cool to see Wizards' Bastion system take a different approach at solving the same problem. And that's maybe the thing I'm most interested in.
There's an interesting element of like, whether it's catering to the play of like, there's big gaps in time between your adventures and your heroes go off and do their own thing in between. And this is kind of downtime solo adventures and things that they can do. Or whether it's like Castle Grayskull from Critical Role, where you just kind of hang out in between and you just get your little buffs and then you go back out on the next adventure. But I would love to hear from Shawn about like what the philosophy of Strongholds was originally.
Well, in AD&D, I remember when my highest level character finally reached enough levels in Cleric to build their temple. That was one way that a player could build the world. You couldn't build the adventure because that was the DM. You could build the campaign, that was the DM or the campaign guide that they had purchased. But you could make your own stronghold. And I remember getting out my graph paper and spending my hard-earned coin on this room and that room. And if I cast Word of Recall to be able to teleport back to my place, that's where I went. And all of that was done. And other people in my party gave money and they had their own rooms in my temple. And so I think as a wizard, you could build a tower. As a cleric, you could build a temple, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been handled differently throughout the editions. I invite you to buy the Acquisitions Incorporated book where you can build your franchise, which is a stronghold and a business. And you can use your downtime to build up your stronghold or take your followers and have them do things for you. Or so that's one way to look at it. I invite you to look at the Oracle of War campaign where they had salvage missions. The whole campaign was going into the Mournland and salvaging things, or that's how it started. So you could build a salvage base with your party, and you'd go earn salvage, bring it back, and use it to build up your salvage base, which James Introcaso was the main driver behind creating those rules. And it's been done over and over and over again in many different ways. And I invite you to look at all of those ways to see what fits best for your party. Is it Strongholds and Followers? Is it what Wizards will do with Bastions? Is it something much less restrictive, or is it something that you need the openness of your imagination to be able to actually do? And how mechanical do you want to make it? All of those questions can be answered by a different system.
I think what I like about what they're selling with Bastions, somebody asking, is it a bite-sized version of GMing? Players can have a Bastion turn away from the table. Players can kind of, run their Bastion themselves. Is that something that I found in my play group with some of my friends is the hobby of D&D sometimes feels like there's limited things you can do when you're not at the table in terms of participating in your hobby in your own free time. I think it's why a lot of players have 20 or 70 characters on D&D Beyond or wherever they've made them that they'll never play, just because creating characters is kind of participating in the hobby on a Saturday afternoon when you've got, spare time instead of playing a video game or whatever. War games, usually it's painting miniatures. Card games, I assume it's kind of building decks, is that thing. But D&D can sometimes feel like, well, I've got my character. I don't really want to make a new one, and I'm not the GM, so I don't need to prep a world. What can I do to participate in my hobby when I'm not at the game table? And I kind of like this as a potential avenue for that, whether it's rules supported by taking a Bastion turn, or whether it's just, as you were saying, Shawn, like drawing artwork of your Bastion or a map of your Bastion, or kind of like, writing your own little backstory for an NPC that appears in your Bastion or something like that. I really like that aspect of it and what it, offers players from that avenue. Reticence as a GM on the flip side of that is I'm really glad for players to have a part of the world they feel like they can build. But as someone who's a little maybe overly precious about like what the world looks like and what the players are adding to the world in terms of how that, what that says about the campaign world that you're creating together, It doesn't concern me. I don't want to overplay it because I would prefer my players have fun and kind of explore that system. But it does make me a little bit apprehensive about what I'm about to be presented with. And also
what could they do that would be Bastions crossing that line for you, for example? So we've defeated the vampires, blah, blah, blah. What do the players do that makes your skin crawl?
I mean, it's again like saying Bastion? that it makes my skin crawl is maybe overplaying it.
I don't know, man. I was looking at your physicality just then. That looked like crawling skin to me.
No, to be honest, the physicality is me more being uncomfortable with my own feelings about it because I don't like being a no fun or coming across as a no fun GM.
Tell me, Benjamin. What do you hate that the players can do?
To answer your question, I don't know if this is doable in the Bastion system for the record, but to answer the question, it would be like, okay, I have a bunch of Heragon like show up and they're my, like all the rabbit people are like my NPCs hanging out in my Bastion, or I've opened a portal to an interplanar space that, opens out onto another dimension, or I have a vampire working for me because, vampires are now, I'm the person in charge. I don't know, great examples or not great examples, but just things that like I have to like stop for a minute and wrap my head around as the GM and be like, okay, does that make sense? I guess it doesn't matter. If it makes sense to them, it makes sense. It's just, it's my own hang up, really.
But I think it's a common hang up. I don't think it's so out of the ordinary to say that there are a lot of GMs who really like to keep sort of tight control of their world. And I would say there's also a lot of players who are nervous about taking control of the world because they're trying to be gracious towards the GM who they view as sort of the master of what is canon or what is the sort of narrative law of the land. And D&D is typically a system that encourages that kind of thinking. There are other systems powered by the Apocalypse or Daggerheart for one, or other systems that really encourage a more sort of shared narrative world. D&D kind of wants to be all things to all people. And this might be an attempt to offer a branch to the kind of gamer that really likes to share narrative control. And, there's many, many gamers like that who keep playing D&D for a lot of reasons. Usually because a group of gamers is made up of people with kind of overlapping but not identical interests, right? I think an interesting pain point that we may see in the Bastion system, insofar as it offers a Bastion to everyone, is there will probably be one or two characters who care way more about their Bastion than the other players care about theirs. And does that offer, does that bias the game as a whole? Does the system being biased in favor of one person's interest bias the entire game in favor of them? It's possible. But I think there's a world in which we see a player who loves the Bastion and a player who loves the combat and a player who loves the role play. And, the Venn diagram exists, but it's weighted in different ways.
What a game master can do then is use all of those points to make every part of the game more powerful. The person who loves combat, in order to learn that new feat, you need to create the Bastion that's going to draw an instructor to you. For the person who, only cares about the Bastion, your Bastion's going to be attacked. And if you can't defend it, you're going to lose it. So you better hang out with some people who are going to help defend it. And you can really tell a great campaign story and draw in all of those different and diverse loves from your players by digging into these different systems and drawing out the essence of them.
One thing they said in the video, which made me go like, oh, okay, interesting. Because I think it's a positive thing about the Bastions is, I think the phrase was, the Bastion is not a dagger for your GM to use against the players. The intention isn't that the GM can just constantly imperil your Bastions as a way to, motivate the party. That being said, I'm curious what rules they've baked in, if any, to imperil Bastions, because I understand, no, they shouldn't necessarily be something just like a NPC that's close to the party shouldn't be a constant dagger that the GM just kind of imperils to try to motivate the party. A campaign that I ran, they started with a tavern that they were running, and not the first thing, but after they kind of antagonized the local villains, one of the first things that happened was that the tavern got burned down. And this motivated the party, and it was the call to adventure. Was like, okay, well, that we don't have anything anchoring in this city anymore. Let's go get those people.
Also, the call to adventure in Muppet Treasure Island. Probably also
yes,
Treasure Island.
There you go.
I'm not going to hide what my point of reference is.
And you've also just given me a great idea, Shawn, which is like, if you've got a fortress bastion or even a city, you've got several bastions within a city. But let's say it's a fortress for now. and the player has drawn maps of their bastion, how cool would it be if the GM then goes, okay, well, they're coming to get your bastion. You need to be there to defend it, and then creates combat encounters using the maps of the bastion as the battle maps, and finding ways for the player to like defend the bastion mechanically to be able to withstand an assault or a siege or something like that. I think is fertile storytelling.
It's peak. It's peak.
Speaking of peak, the Grim Hollow Kickstarter is absolute peak, let me tell you. And we are extremely close to unlocking the $500,000 stretch goal. I just want to say quick thank you. We've been launched for about a week now, and I want to express massive gratitude for everybody who has pledged so far. Our Discord has been really awesome to hang out in, and the $500,000 stretch goal is a community-led one. So you can make suggestions. We've already got a bunch of suggestions in the community, from updates to our Grim Hollow Artificer to tarot cards to other transformations to, all sorts of things. So if you've been eyeing the Grim Hollow Kickstarter, now is the time to jump on board. I will grab a link to throw into the chat, but if you're watching this on YouTube, the link will be just above Shawn, or it will be down below in the description. And you can check it out. I was thinking before, Shawn, for players that are interested in bastions, give them a bastion. But if a player doesn't want a bastion, maybe they get a transformation instead. And that's kind of the, where these different rules can balance out what players can play with.
Maybe you can transform into a bastion.
The bastion transformation.
Yeah,
that's going to be the community stretch goal.
You're aware bastion.
Yeah, exactly. We have more stretch goals in mind as well as we continue on. So feel free to jump on board. While you're checking out that, we are going to talk about Kyle's question, who emailed James. Go.
Oh my God. It's about low magic.
It is.
Where did he email?
Well, he emailed at podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Well, low magic is a fascinating issue. How does one go about running a low magic game? Does it have to be done at the setting level? Does it have to be done at the system level? Kyle seems to think that a low magic game would be very difficult to run in the Forgotten Realms. And if 5e D&D even is the best vehicle for such a game and story at that point, if low magic limits so many of the class's core features, given how many classes, even not full casters, have a great deal of magic involved in them. A very interesting question, because I might hazard a guess that all of us have, at one point or another, tried a low magic D&D game.
Yeah, I mean, I famously have. I love doing low magic campaigns. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week.
Did you use
talking
the 5e
about,
system for it?
Yes, I did. And many of the concerns that Kyle kind of cites in their email around, like, how do you deal with the fact that the classes are so powerful, magically speaking? That's true. And the general approach, as we kind of mentioned last week, was that for me personally, it's like, just because the party is this magically gifted doesn't mean everybody in the world needs to be. Just stripping the magic out of the streets of the cities and the villages can help ground the campaign on its own. And that's not to say there aren't powerful people within the world that can challenge the party, magically speaking. But instead of like the magic shop down on the corner and the cleric who casts Revivify at the chapel and the quirky wizard in the tower and the king who's got, an advisor who's magic and this person's magic and that person's magic, you kind of consolidate all those, and it's like, oh yes, nobody goes to Grisham's tower anymore. He used to sell magic items from there and was the advisor to many kings, but has since fallen silent and nobody has seen the wizard in a very, very long time. And so magic has not, I'm sorry, I got to interrupt myself. 500,000, we just hit 500,000 on the Kickstarter.
Ben, I'm going to interrupt you.
I'm going to interrupt your interruption.
Well, you're spraying champagne. I'm getting back to low magic, because I think if we're going to have this conversation, we've got to talk about what the hell low magic actually means.
Well, this is where Kyle literally called me out.
Yeah, he roasts Shawn in the bottom of his email.
And he's like, and I know what Shawn's going to say. Shawn's going to say, well, no, you don't know what I'm going to say. Actually, you did know what I was going to say. And it's exactly what James said. low magic for some people is exactly what's been described here. The setting is low magic. But what some people mean by low magic is low power, that the characters have less power than they would in a higher fantasy or heroic fantasy campaign. Low magic does not necessarily mean low power, as we see by the weapon properties part of 2024, because now the weapons are doing things that a spell would have otherwise done. So you can run a low magic campaign that is super powerful, but you need to have a reason why a character can damage 7 creatures at once with fire if you want that high power feel in a low magic setting.
I think the problem, like the reason I prefer 5e and playing it in low magic versus certain other systems, and to be fair, I haven't necessarily played all of these, but compared to something like Call of Cthulhu or OSR, is that the term? Kind of systems, is that they're not just intended to be low magic, but they are intended to make the characters feel low powered as well. And when I get into, like they say in Call of Cthulhu, if you get into combat, you've already messed up. Most of the Call of Cthulhu games I've played have ended up in combat, probably because they're convention games where, you know, we're trying to do an exciting specific thing in that game. But I always get into those situations and I don't feel engaged as a player of a game because I'm like, well, what am I meant to do? I don't know. I run away. Like, is that fun? You know, like, is that, okay, all right, let me try to think about this more critically. I try to drive a car into the monster and try to do damage to it that way. And I do a modicum of damage and then the monster like squashes me inside the car. And I'm like, well, that wasn't fun. You know, like that's why I agree with you, Shawn. I like low magic, but not necessarily low power for the characters. I still want them to feel like Geralt of Rivia, Guts from Berserk, you know, those powerful characters within their grim low magic worlds.
Yeah, and what we're seeing here is low magic is this weird thorny tangle of game design and world building and most nebulous of all, tone or even genre. Because if I were to play a horror game, I think a lot of the wind would be sucked out of the horror by giving me an AK-47 full of silver bullets right at the very beginning. That would make it more of a sort of Doom, Duke Nukem sort of thing. And if I were playing a stealth game, I've had many stealth, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a game I love, is not a stealth game to me. It is an action game with stealth elements, as opposed to like Assassin's Creed 2, which is a stealth game, because you are so
Assassin's
powerful
Creed lost
at a baseline.
stealth around the time of 3.
And like, you know, I mean, that doesn't necessarily make them bad games, but it does make them very different games. Because if I'm playing Thief is a great example. If I can get
actually, that is a great example, because Assassin's Creed, some of it depends on how good you are at the game. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Anyway, all this to say, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey has more in common with Skyrim to me than it does with other Assassin's Creed games because of the general power level you have. It's still in its way low magic. I'd say Assassin's Creed is lower magic than Skyrim is because you're not slinging fireballs, even though you do meet gods and monsters. It has this sort of tactile reality to it, even when Medusa shows up as a boss fight.
I agree. Just with the silver bullet machine gun, you gave me an image. It's a bunch of werewolves. They're like eating some people. They're, you know, blood all over their face and the sound of munching. And then Schwarzenegger kicks open the door with a machine gun and says, "You forgot the silverware."
McBain.
Oh,
yeah, there you go.
So good. So good.
No, I love Blade.
Yeah, there you go.
I do think it's interesting because, I mean, this has been alluded to by others in this conversation, but to say it very plainly, it is interesting that 5e as a system prioritizes combat, and the way those mechanics for combat come across, for some people that might not be a barrier at all to what they envision as low fantasy, such as Ben, or for some people, the idea that, like, if you think about like a Call of Cthulhu game, the idea that you can fight this mighty powerful thing, and this treads on horror maybe more than high or low fantasy, but you know, the idea that you can fight that starts to kind of wear away a little bit at that idea of magic being so powerful and beyond you. You know what I mean? Like, if you can shoot it, then it takes a little bit of that away for some people, depending on your definition. And so you do start to see how system really plays into it. And I mean, that's not even to touch on the really obvious stuff like Vancian magic versus, I don't know, some other form of magic from a different game.
But you mentioned Vancian magic, and so AD&D and second edition was sort of starts as a low magic game and then becomes a high magic game, because at first level you're casting 2 spells and then you're done, and those spells you're casting probably aren't doing a heck of a lot, and then you're just shooting a crossbow as the spellcaster or as the cleric or as any of the spellcasters. Whereas at 10th level and higher, now you've got this full range of spells that can fix any problem, including doing a lot of damage, and then it becomes high magic. Whereas over the editions, we've sort of seen that we need the magic to work at the lowest levels too, constantly, because we want everyone to feel powerful all the time.
Well, I think it's also you don't want to create a wizard and then start needing to use a crossbow for a couple of levels. You know what I mean? Like, I think in D&D kind of specifically, that had always been my assumption as to the rationale of why magic had been made more accessible at lower levels. Is it's a feel bad moment to envisage your character even as an apprentice wizard and then have to run around with a crossbow and a dagger, because that's the only tools available for you to access the combat at early levels. But that being said, it's interesting. Starts as low magic, then goes to high magic as players unlock more magic. But I think there's a real problem with the definition of low magic here, because DM Rollins in chat just said, I really enjoy settings where magic is neither high nor low. It's just exotic and ancient and unknowable, which is low magic to me.
That's
that's
low
what.
magic.
That's,
No.
You know,
this is valuable. This is valuable. This is why I refuse in my videos to talk about high or low magic. This is why I say things like vague and evocative. It's why I say things like pervasive magic, because I think it is valuable for you as a DM. If you want to run a campaign that's a little bit less boopity boop Home Alone with wizards, I think it is valuable for you to sit down, figure out what your definition of your magic is, and then put a label to it that is different from high or low. I was joking a little bit in chat just before. I was saying high, low, shallow, deep, wide, narrow. But finding a word that is different from high or low magic that you can pin to it that just sets it apart, so that you are thinking about your definition and not some other person's definition and not getting swept away with that, is a great starting point to figuring out whether you can play that kind of magic in this system that you're trying to use, and what you need to change. Where do you need to start kind of tweaking things in order to fit that vibe? Because the vibes, the genre, the tone are going to be different from person to person to person. And the power of language is not to be underestimated.
And given that D&D is, as its designers have said, a game coded in the English language, much like a video game could be coded in C or Java, that's very important. We can look to the magic systems of Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson as good points of comparison. D&D is in many ways a very scientific form of magic, simply by virtue of all the spells being sort of bound by the physics of the rules. And I don't think the D&D developers always want that, but it is the house they've built.
Is it necessary because it's a rule system? Like, I had always envisaged a sort of magic system where, you know, you might have D6s that like a pool of D6s that represent your mana pool, right? And maybe martial classes or more physical characters have like a stamina pool instead of D6s. But focusing on magic for the second, you say, all right, I know fire magic. So all my magic has like a fire element to it. Maybe you add other elements to that as well. And then you're like, I want to hit this goblin with a bolt of flame. So I'm going to roll a D6 out of my pool, and that D6 is spent to attack that goblin with a firebolt. Or I want to weave a wheel of fire and then throw it at the goblin to try to make it explode. And I'm going to spend 3d6s because this is a larger magical effect that I'm trying to pull off. But the rules simply say, choose how many dice you want to roll and what element or what type of magic you're casting, and then make up an effect. So that same 3d6s and that same fire tag could be used to set a house on fire or something like that. but rules, that the intention of that system is to make magic feel more magical and more like casters or weavers, but that makes it innately loosier-goosier and harder to define like how strong a spell should be based on the number of dice spent, right?
Yeah, to answer that, Ben, Fate, right? Fate would do that. Fate would make you rate your aspect down, and your aspect might be a master of cryo magic, so you can manipulate cold. And then all you would do is the same thing that someone would do if they were the master of the sword, right? You would roll those funky little 4 fate dice, add them up, use your aspect, use your fate points, and come up with something. And what's the first thing that people who tried to make Fate into like a fantasy D&D clone do? They tried to give form to spells, because that's where their brain went, as opposed to just enjoying the freedom and the imaginative play of being able to create on the fly. So something in our brain, whether it's a D&D bias or a need to know what we can do with our game turns, pervades all games at some point, I think.
Before we run out of time, I want to talk about sort of narrative versus mechanical games, using an element from Zach's question that we didn't talk about, or Kyle's question, I mean, because Kyle mentions this would be difficult to implement in the Forgotten Realms unless there was some calamity that snuffed out the weave. And when I first read that element, I thought, well, what a waste of D&D as a system. D&D has many elements, so many elements that it's very easy to swap out or even remove subsystems entirely and still have enough of a game to have a great time with it, right? D&D is so complex. And I recoiled at the idea of just like gutting the entire magic system because the weave is gone. No weave, no magic. I mean, that's it. All magic, spells or otherwise, is the weave. But when you started talking about sort of more narratively based systems, Ben, I like sort of narratively make it up, bid some dice, do some stuff systems. I really like it. And I also find that I enjoy it for different reasons from D&D. Because when I use spells in D&D, they're like keys to a lock or pieces in a puzzle. I enjoy the specificity of D&D spells because I get to think with tools and sort of manipulatable objects, whereas I don't get to do that there. And thinking of a campaign in which magic could slowly return to the world, or you could start to weave together scraps of the weave itself to slowly return magic as a concept and gaining magical powers as these discrete, almost sort of like Metroid or Zelda-like power-ups that your characters gain, rather than this sprawling subsystem that defines entire classes. That seems like a cool way to kind of break apart and remake D&D as a system. If everyone is a fighter and a rogue and something like that, and they start getting magical abilities and the ability to multi-class into wizard and stuff like that.
When you said a magical calamity that destroyed the weave, you're talking about 4th edition.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yeah.
People in chat must be screaming. I can't see that, but I assume people are like, the spell plague? Is that what you're talking about? Where Mistra goes up
wild.
in smoke? And,
Can you imagine if the canon of D&D was like, the weave is back. Oh, it's gone again. Sorry, guys. We got rid of it
again. Spell plague 2.
Back with our vengeance.
Marvel Comics.
There's the McBain movie that Wizards of the Coast are working on. This podcast is going to turn into low magic, and by that I mean off. Reach time.
Going into low power mode.
We will be back next week with an episode online, which will be our PAX panel. We are streaming next week. You'll catch us at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on the Monday, or Tuesday, 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. It's summer, yay! Or I believe 7 a.m. Perth time. You can correct me on that, Pats, if I'm wrong. Or you can find us on YouTube. Likes, subscribes, stars if you're on Spotify or another platform. We appreciate you all, and we it's how we get out to more listeners is people know about us because they're like, no, this seems like a pretty good podcast. It's 4.9. That's great. I'm going to listen to
gonna
this.
go.
That's what people do. Anyway, I'm going to disappear. As are we all? My name's Ben Byrne here with Shawn and James Hake Dael Kingsmill, and I cast Banishment on this podcast.
Bastion. Da 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 da.
Yeah, there you go. That's good. That's good. Cool.
GG, everyone.
Butters.
You butted in your last